Meanwhile, the background of our lives in Germany was falling to pieces. There was a sensation of doom to be felt in the Berlin streets. For years, the newspapers contained little news but of growing unemployment and increased taxation necessary to pay reparations and doles. The Nazis at the one extreme, and the communists at the other, with their meetings, their declamatory newspapers, their uniformed armies of youths, their violence against the Republic and against one another, did all in their power to exacerbate the situation. Pruning had abandoned the attempt to govern through the yelling mob of members of 29 different political parties, which was the Reichstag, broadcasts of whose howling debates, punctuated by a tinkling bell, were a feature of the German wireless, and, using emergency powers under the Constitution, governed by decree. Every decree, accompanied by dissenting cries of dictatorship from the extreme right and the extreme left, produced an impression of the Pruning cabinet as a little boat manned by a hopeless crew trying to navigate an unending storm. The feeling of unrest in Berlin went deeper than any crisis. It was a permanent unrest, the result of nothing being fixed and settled. The Pruning regime was neither democracy nor dictatorship, socialism or conservatism. It represented no group nor class, only a common fear of the overwhelming disorder, which formed a kind of rallying place of frightened people. It was the Weimar Dämmerung. Tugged by forces within and without, by foreign powers and foreign moneylenders, industrialist plotters, embittered generals, impoverished landed gentry, potential dictators, refugees from Eastern Europe, it reeled from crisis to crisis within a permanent crisis. In this Berlin, the poverty, the agitation, the propaganda, witnessed by us in the streets and cafes, seemed more and more to represent the whole life of the town, as though there were almost no privacy behind doors. Berlin was the tension, the poverty, the anger, the prostitution, the hope and despair thrown out onto the streets. It was the blatant rich at the smart restaurants, the prostitutes in army top boots at corners, the grim, submerged-looking communists in processions, and the violent youths who suddenly emerged from nowhere into the Wittenbergplatz and shouted, "Deutschland erwache!" Germany had been pushed down to that level, where the members of every group were conscious of themselves as a political interest. The prosperity of some was the direct result of the inflation. There was a row of luxurious new houses in Hamburg, known to the population as Inflationsstrasse, which had been the ruin of others. Almost no one had interests above and outside the immediate day-to-day political situation. Not only were nearly all thus conscious of being politically involved, persecuting and persecuted, but events wore the same political aspect. When, for example, the Darmstadter National Bank failed, there was an atmosphere of general collapse in Berlin for a few days. The Nazi newspaper, Der Angriff, trying to push the Republic over the abyss, came out with the headline, "Alles bricht zusammen." A spell of intensely cold weather, by increasing misery, throwing workers out of employment, and thus adding a burden to the dole, became a political crisis threatening the government, and welcomed by the Nazis and communists. Thus the whole of Germany was politicized in a way which divided it against itself. The depressed and partly ruined middle classes attributed their downfall to the Jews and to the Polish refugees who had poured into Berlin after 1918. The aristocrats and generals considered themselves to be fighting for the survival of the noblest German tradition against foreign elements and proletarianization. In the course of their self-righteous struggle, General Schleicher, the Hindenburg family, von Papen, and the rest made strange allies and corrupting compromises. The Jews and intellectuals, attacked by the Nazis and nationalists, were fighting for survival. The workers were class-conscious, but wooed by communists and Nazis, and some of them remained staunch social democrats. The young, finding themselves thrust into a world of unemployment, were enlisted by parties which promised them a future of work and prosperity, and which even gave them present opportunities to strut about in uniforms and feel important. Christopher and I, leading our life, in which we used Germany as a kind of cure for our personal problems, became ever aware that the carefree personal lives of our friends were facades in front of the immense social chaos. There was more and more a feeling that this life would be swept away. When we were on holiday at Inselrügen, where the naked bathers in their hundreds lay stretched on the beach under the drugging sun. Sometimes we heard orders rapped out, and even shots, from the forest whose edges skirted the shore, where the storm troopers were training like executioners, waiting to martyr the naked and self-disarmed. In 1929, I had first heard of Hitler when, in between the singing of Bavarian songs, Joachim had told me of an orator from Austria who had a power of speech which those who listened to him called hypnotic, whilst realizing that he talked nonsense. Hitler was regarded as a kind of wonder whom one did not have to take seriously. But 2 years later in Berlin, the Soloveitchiks were beginning to make grimly comforting jokes to the effect that the Jews had nothing to fear. For every Nazi, although an anti-Semite, had his favorite Jew whom he wished to spare from persecution, and that made up as many Jews as all the Nazis. In the summer of 1932, a friend of Christopher's, Wilfred Israel, came to stay with us in Selin. One day, he and I went for a walk together through the forest. He was an elegant, distinguished, dark-eyed young man whose family owned one of the great department stores in East Berlin. Wilfred Israel surprised me during our walk by outlining a plan of action for the Jews when Hitler seized Germany, an event which he seemed to anticipate as certain. The Jews, he said, should close their businesses and go out into the streets, remaining there as a protest, and refusing to go home even if the stormtroopers fired on them. It was only such a united action, within a hopeless situation, which would arouse the conscience of the world. Nearly all the German intellectuals whom we knew accepted and practiced a kind of orthodoxy of the left. This attitude influenced the theatre, the novel, the cinema, and even music and painting. So great was the unanimity of opinion that it occurred to me once that perhaps these people, just because they appeared to have arrived at their political views so easily, might be wrong. After all, the Nazis, whom they so hated, claimed to be socialists and were opposed to the treatment of Germany by the Allies, which I was opposed to also. Possibly Germany was in a position where socialism could only be achieved by a virulently nationalist party. I decided that I must study the Nazi point of view, so I bought the Nazi program and a good deal of the literature of Goebbels and the other Nazi propagandists. I found that they were written with a blatant cynicism and brutality, which could deceive no one. So far from pretending to believe their own propaganda, or even doing their followers the service of trying to deceive them, the Nazis openly proclaimed that the purpose of propaganda was to state, without any regard for truth, lies which served their cause. After I had read this literature, I knew that I hated the Nazis. One day Isherwood told me that he had received a letter from his greatest Cambridge friend, whom he has called Chalmers in his autobiographical sketch Lions and Shadows, saying that Chalmers had joined the Communist Party. We regarded this as an extraordinary action. Communism to us was an extremist, almost unnatural cause, and we found it hard to believe that any of our friends could be communists. However, Chalmers' action deepened our interest in Berlin politics. We discussed them with our friends, went to political meetings, read the newspapers and a good deal of political literature attentively. Whenever we could, we went to see those Russian films, which were shown often in Berlin at this period. Earth, The General Line, The Mother, Potemkin, 10 Days That Shook the World, The Way into Life, etc. These films, which form a curiously isolated episode in the aesthetic history of this century, excited us because they had the modernism, the poetic sensibility, the satire, the visual beauty, all those qualities we found most exciting in other forms of modern art. But they also conveyed a message of hope, like an answer to the wasteland. They extolled a heroic attitude which had not yet become officialized. In this, they foreshadowed the defiant individualism of the Spanish Republicans. We used to go long journeys to little cinemas in the outer suburbs of Berlin, and there, among the grimy tenements, we saw the images of the new life of the workers building with machine tools and tractors their socially just world under the shadows of baroque statues reflected in ruffled waters of Leningrad or against waving shadow-penciled plains of corn. Upon us, in this restless and awakening mood, came Isherwood's friend Chalmers on his way back to England from an in-tourist tour of Moscow. Very much the emissary of a cause, he seemed, with his miniature sensitive beauty of features, his keen smiling yet dark glance, his way of holding the stem of his pipe with his finely formed fingers of a chiseller's or woodgraver's hand. He was not unlike the smiling young Komsomol hero who saves the boys in the reform school in one of our favorite films, The Way into Life. 2 days after his arrival, he and I went for a walk. I remember that we went through that part of Berlin where roads connect the Tiergarten, the Bahnhof am Zoom, and the Gedächtniskirche, a church on a road island, with the traffic streaming all round it. The pressure of what Chalmers said to me was not just his words, but a consciousness of Berlin, of unemployment and fascism, and, dimly beyond that day, of the day 15 years later when I would walk along the same road and see the Gedächtniskirche, which had looked, on the occasion of our walk, like an absurdly ornate, overlarge inkstand set down in the middle of the traffic, transformed into a neo-Gothic ruin, having about it something of senile dignity. What Chalmers was really asking me was, as though we both looked through the transparent traffic on to the ruin, how to stop this happening, how to prevent this Europe being destroyed in the war which, as he analyzed the situation, was certain to arise from recrudescent German nationalism, supported by American and British capitalism, and flung, as he thought it would be, against Russia. I gave my stumbling answers. I desired social justice. I abhorred war. I could not accept the proposition that to resist evil we must renounce freedom and accept dictatorship and methods of revolutionary violence. Chalmers, who had listened intently, smiling slightly to himself, observed quietly, when I had finished speaking, "Gandhi." My vaguely distressed consciousness now began to formulate itself along lines laid down by Marxist arguments. The essential ideas which moved me were, firstly, the inevitable development of social situations resulting from analyzable material conditions; secondly, the division of the world into two interests, the bourgeois and the proletarian, which represented not just political views, but also influenced the whole pattern of behavior and thought and culture of everyone who belonged to them. Until now I had, I suppose, thought of myself as being a member of society, in the same way as a passenger thinks of himself belonging to the ship on which he is carried. The very fact of my being in Germany, a country where I was a foreigner, emphasized my outside position to myself. I pitied the unemployed, deplored social injustices, wished for peace, and held socialist views. These attitudes were emotional, and I used them as a way of proving my own values to myself and testing my sincerity in some hypothetical situation. The opposite feelings to pity and sympathy and well-wishing would not have done me credit in my own eyes. The hypothetical test was to ask myself whether I was really prepared to make sacrifices if socialism happened, when I found myself a member of a classless society. The answer to this question was that, on the whole, I thought I would. But a more significant fact was that I thought of socialism as happening outside me, within a society of which I did not think of myself as a part. In general, I thought of public events as happening more or less incalculably, as the result of clashes of interests, economic factors, the influence of outstanding personalities in political life. The future was always uncertain, and this made it unreal to me. For example, I could not think that in 1931 a war which would take place 8 years later existed within the structure of events, like the foundation stone beneath a building, or like past history. That unless the structure was altered, the war would inevitably take place, and that in order to alter it, methods would have to be used which could really achieve the alteration. As all political events, solid as they might seem today, appeared to liquefy in the uncertainty of tomorrow, it seemed to me enough that I should preserve a guileless attitude in relation to them. But during the coming years, I began to appreciate the seriousness of the political situation, that within today there were not only all the injustices of the day, producing unemployment, poverty, and exploitation, but also the victims of tomorrow, buried, as it were, within its structure, all the shot-down pilots, the inmates of concentration camps, and participants in war. A generation then at school, training, if one viewed things in this way, to be shot down by machine guns. This Berlin contained within a pattern, partly its own, and partly imposed on it by the folly of the victors of the war of 1914-18, its own ruins, and the ruins of the European cities, exactly as if buildings and their ruins coexisted. For they already were within the political situation. And now I saw that a personal self-righteousness, whereby I secretly washed my hands of social guilt, had no objective value. A debate which still continues had begun in my mind. I was impressed by the overwhelming accusation made by communism against bourgeois society, an accusation not only against all its institutions, but also reaching deep into the individual soul. When I considered the existing injustices and the future destruction which were involved in the system in which I lived, I longed to be on the side of the accusers, the setters up of world socialism. But at this stage, having shifted the center of the struggle within myself, from the bourgeois camp to the communist one, I failed to find myself convinced by communism. Even when I had accepted in my own mind the possibility of having to sacrifice everything I gained by living in a bourgeois society, I still could not abandon my liberal concepts of freedom and truth. The Marxist challenge thrown out in the Communist Manifesto, that the opponents of communism were concerned only with their freedom, their truth, and that all their ideas were rationalizations of their interests, made me think out for myself the position of the freedom of the individual. It became extremely important to answer the question, was my sense of my own individuality simply an expression of the class interest which I, unknowingly and instinctively, in everything I thought and wrote and did, represented? If this was so, must I accept the argument that to alter my position, I must make myself its exact opposite, a function of the proletariat? When I had admitted to myself the force behind the Marxist arguments, I still found in myself a core of resistance to the idea that if I was a Marxist, my conceptions of freedom and truth must simply be behavior and facts dictated by Marxist expediency. This hard core was the point in my self-examination when the rather abstract phrase, freedom of the individual, became replaced by the more concrete one, independent witnessing. However much a projection of class interest the mind of the individual may be, I was persuaded there was a point where he chose simply to witness truths which served no interest. Another objection to communism, which I could never overcome, was to what I called in my own mind the world provincialism of Marxism. I can explain this best by a hypothetical illustration. Suppose that in a corner of Africa there are two tribes, A and B, interlocked in a historic struggle. In such a conflict, Marxism assumes that each must think entirely in terms of its own interest in asserting itself and overcoming the other. Suppose that tribe B is in a state of historic decline, has been wasting its own resources and compensating for this by raiding and enslaving tribe A, so that historically it is doomed to exhaust not only itself, but, owing to its internal contradictions, tribe A as well. Then the historic task of tribe A is to throw off tribe B and establish a system with a political and economic future. This means that the whole view of life of everyone in tribe A must be directed towards this aim. Whatever does not serve this end is not truth for tribe A. The story that there are white men living beyond the furthest mountain ranges and having factories and great ships is only a myth serving the interests of tribe B by distracting the attention of the warriors of tribe A from their historic task. This stifling provincialism is the communist attitude applied to the class struggle of the whole world within history and the universe. Philosophic speculation, unpropagandist art, and even scientific research, which do not serve the interest of the workers, are labeled idealistic, untruthful, escapist, and reactionary. The insistent philosophic materialism of the communist dogmatists struck me as characteristic of their way of overreaching themselves in order to achieve concentration of purpose on immediate aims, by depriving their followers of a moral attitude which has anything in common with that of the rest of humanity. To divide humanity into irreconcilable groups with irreconcilable attitudes, having no common language of truth and morality, is, ultimately, to rob both groups of their humanity. They will be inhuman first to one another, and lastly to their own followers. From 1931 onwards, in common with many other people, I felt hounded by external events. There was ever-increasing unemployment in America, Great Britain, and on the continent. The old world seemed incapable of solving its problems, and out of the disorder fascist regimes were rising. There was the feeling through all these years of having to race against time to produce a book or a poem. Not only was this disturbing to the stillness of attention necessary for creative work, but the life itself out of which the work grew was being borne away from under us. No wonder that the literature of this period is time-obsessed, time-tormented, as though beaten with rods of restless days. From notes which I kept at this time, notes of such urgency that they even interrupt the manuscript sketches of poems, I find that there were two things which incessantly preoccupied me. One was the problem of the freedom of the individual, which I have just discussed. The other was the problem of the sense of guilt. For if, on the one hand, the communists told me that my sense of freedom was only a projection of the interest of the bourgeois class, there was also a Freudian argument which told me that I only troubled about these things out of a sense of guilt. Rid myself of guilt, and I would no longer worry about my privileged position in society. What I gradually came to see is that there is not just one guilt, but many guilts, and that we must learn to distinguish between these, discarding useless guilt and making use of that kind of guilt which, so far from inhibiting us, releases us. For example, it was useless guilt which prevented me criticizing my Hamburg friend Walter, because, feeling myself involved in a gigantic lie of my whole social heritage, I could not criticize his small dishonesties. On the other hand, in discarding the attitude which prevented me from helping Walter, I would have been mistaken to discard also what was valuable in this attitude, the realization that my own position did rest on a social injustice. Thus, although guilt may create for us a kind of stumbling darkness in which we cannot act, it is also the thread leading us out of a labyrinth into places where we accept, instead of being overwhelmed by, the responsibility of action.